What if I told you the most powerful monarch in Europe, the man who called himself the Sun King, ruled not from a throne of grace, but from the center of a palace that reeked of human waste, sour sweat, infected wounds, and rotting meat? What if I told you Versailles, the grand symbol of elegance, symmetry, and order, was one of the filthiest places ever constructed, by design? This is not a story about perfume and powdered wigs. It's about control, about illusion, about how King Louis XIV turned filth into theater, turned bodily decay into divine ritual, and ruled a court where hygiene was not just neglected, it was deliberately twisted into performance. Would you survive a single day of Versailles without toilets, privacy, or dignity? Comment below. Because Versailles wasn't just a palace. It was a cage made of mirrors and gold, and what it reflected was not nobility, but rot. The year was 1682. Louis XIV officially moved his court from the Louvre to the newly expanded Château de Versailles. It was a palace unlike any in Europe. Over 2,000 rooms, gilded ceilings, gardens so large they needed their own army, and fountains that danced for royal eyes. But it had no bathrooms, no working drainage, no sewage plan. Why? Because the king didn't care. Cleanliness, in Louis's world, was not about health. It was about image. Toilets were vulgar. Washing was dangerous. Disease came from bad air, not dirty skin. So instead of plumbing, he gave the court theater. And behind that performance, his courtiers lived like animals in a gilded barn. Guests routinely relieved themselves behind curtains, in hallways, on stairwells, or wherever was most discreetly out of view. Chamber pots overflowed. Servants often dumped them out of upper windows directly into the gardens, drenching hedges in urine and feces. The grand gravel walkways stank. The garden mazes were dotted with human waste. The fountains? Beautiful. Until you realized the water was pumped from shallow, contaminated ponds and reused without filtration. Disease festered in the pipes. Rats flourished, yet no one dared complain, because to comment on the smell was to insult the crown. And Louis's court lived in constant fear of being banished from proximity to him. He was the center of the universe, Le Roi Soleil, and everything orbited around his image. Even if that image stood ankle-deep in rot, inside the palace it was no better. The air was thick with sweat, powder, rotting food, wet wool, open wounds, menstrual blood, and the musk of 1,000 unwashed nobles trying desperately to look divine. The royal apartments were especially suffocating. Louis rarely bathed. Water, he believed, opened the pores to illness. He preferred dry wiping with scented cloths, followed by layers of powder and perfume. On the rare occasions he was bathed, it was ceremonial, not for cleaning, but for display. His body was coated in oils, salves, ground amber, and musk, but never scrubbed. Over time, his skin festered. He suffered from chronic dental infections, causing his jaw to rot and pus to leak into his throat. His breath stank so badly that courtiers avoided standing directly before him. His rear end developed abscesses so severe that the royal surgeons created a custom operation, the royal anal fistula procedure, just to drain his infected backside. He underwent it without anesthesia, and afterward, instead of resting, he continued his rituals, carried through halls that stank of blood and incense. No one acknowledged the odor. Instead, they bowed. This denial wasn't just royal, it was cultural. Hygiene in Versailles wasn't about removal, it was about covering filth with spectacle. The nobility wore the same gowns for weeks. They layered powder on unwashed skin, shared wigs past lice. Gloves, fans, and scented pouches were standard accessories, less for elegance than for survival. The smell of someone else's infection was constant, Men wore high heels and heavy velvets, sweating through layers. Women fainted in corsets, their ribs bruised, their undergarments soiled. Nobody stopped, nobody questioned it, because the closer you were to the king, the more holy your stench became. His rituals made it law. Courtiers woke at dawn to witness Louis's lever, his ceremonial rising. Hundreds would gather to watch him be dressed, powdered, and perfumed. They'd fight for the honor of handing him a sock, of holding his mirror, of combing his lice-ridden wig. Not because they admired him, but because to serve the rot was to hold power. That rot became currency. Women competed to share his bed, knowing his breath carried disease. Doctors lied about his condition, terrified of court exile. Priests offered blessings for ulcers. Servants swept bloodstains under the rugs, and through it all, Versailles gleamed on the surface. Gold leaf shimmered on ceilings. Mirrors multiplied the illusion. Paintings showed gods, nymphs, and divine light. But below the shine, the palace moaned. Walls wept with moisture. Wood rotted behind panels. Insects crawled through embroidery. Behind the drapes where nobles defecated, the stench clung. And still, Versailles stood as Europe's ideal, because Louis XIV understood one truth better than any king before or after him. If you make the image beautiful enough, people will ignore the smell. He weaponized hygiene by ignoring it. Cleanliness became the privilege of servants. Filth became a mark of status. And Versailles in all its glory became the world's most fragrant prison, one where people drank wine laced with lead, slept in sheets crawling with lice, and bowed to a man whose body rotted from the mouth down. And still, they called him divine, because in the end, Louis didn't need to rule by fear. He ruled by illusion. He didn't need to kill his enemies. He let them live beside him until they choked on the same air. Versailles wasn't just filthy, it was strategic, a masterpiece of decadence designed to make men die quietly behind golden walls. And they did. Hundreds of courtiers collapsed over the years, some from disease, some from poisoning, some from stress, all from a life lived inside a lie. But the lie was beautiful. And in the court of Louis XIV, that was all that mattered. By the time the last bricks of Versailles were laid, the palace stretched over 679,000 square feet, a labyrinth of painted ceilings, golden doorways, mirrored halls, and fountains that sang in sunlight. But not a single one of those rooms was a true bathroom. No toilets, no sewers, no safe private space to relieve oneself, because in the world of King Louis XIV, waste was not a private matter, it was a social one. Where, when, and how you defecated revealed your class, your access to the king, and your place in the hierarchy of rot. Versailles was not designed for comfort, it was designed for proximity, and that included the grotesque closeness of other people's bodies. Courtiers and nobles, dressed in their finest silk, would attend 10-hour-long ceremonies and gatherings with no break and no facility, and so they adapted. Many nobles carried personal chamber pots, hidden in satchels or tucked under long robes. These pots were often emptied by servants into fireplaces, flower beds, or darkened corridors, depending on urgency. But even these were a privilege. Most guests, especially during crowded balls or public festivals, simply found a corner. The grand staircases, often unguarded and lined with drapery, became convenient relief spots. The Hall of Mirrors, now seen as the crown jewel of Versailles, was once lined with the smell of damp wool, perfume, and human waste lingering beneath polished floors. Behind large curtains inside salons, nobles relieved themselves silently, their eyes fixed forward, continuing conversations as if nothing had happened. During garden parties, the hedges were soaked. The famed mazes and alcoves, designed for romance and intrigue, reeked of urine by nightfall. Women used wide, floor-length dresses to shield themselves as they squatted behind bushes or statues. Men, adorned in lace and powder, urinated into flower beds while holding glasses of wine. The smell was inescapable. It mixed with the crushed rose petals and the smoke from candelabras. And yet, the filth was never acknowledged. It was beneath them, and yet literally under their feet. Why not build real bathrooms? Why not install proper latrines? Because privacy was dangerous at Versailles. In a palace ruled by image and access, privacy implied secrets. Secrets implied independence, and Louis XIV would allow neither. Everything at Versailles was meant to be done in view of others, from dressing to eating to even defecating. The ceremony of exposure was what kept his court in check. The king himself set the standard. Each morning, during the lever, his ceremonial waking, dozens of courtiers gathered to watch him be washed, dressed, and relieved. On occasion, Louis would even allow favored nobles to assist while he used his own chaise percée, a glorified gold-trimmed commode placed in his chamber, without shame. Attending to the king's bodily functions was a position of honor, one that gave the lucky noble access to speak to him in the most intimate moments of his day. And so, the court copied him, not just in language or fashion, but in the casual, public acceptance of bodily functions. It became common to witness lords and ladies relieving themselves behind tapestries or columns in full view, cloaked only by protocol and indifference. What mattered was not the filth, but the composure. To flinch at the smell or react to the sound was considered vulgar. The elite trained themselves to behave as if nothing had happened. To exist in shared rot with dignity was a mark of nobility. For the servants and lower-class staff, the reality was worse. With no toilets available and no power to act shamelessly, they were forced to use buckets in servant quarters or squat in the forests beyond the grounds. Their waste, too, was dumped back into the palace gardens. The great fountains of Versailles, while dazzling to look at, were surrounded by bushes soaked in human waste. Even the canal system, meant to reflect the glory of ancient Rome, had sections clogged by chamber pot runoff. And yet, Louis considered this paradise. To him, Versailles was a masterpiece, not of cleanliness, but of control. He had removed his court from Paris, not just to build grandeur, but to isolate the nobility. By forcing them to live in claustrophobic proximity, without privacy, toilets, or escape, he turned even their most basic functions into acts of submission. They could not eat, sleep, defecate, or even dress without awareness of rank. The absence of bathrooms wasn't neglect, it was policy. It was brilliance. The nobles were too preoccupied with status, too distracted by ritual, and too ashamed of complaint to challenge the conditions. And so they endured. They smiled through the smell. They laughed as their gowns dragged across puddles of urine in the marble halls. They complimented each other's perfume while flies hovered around their wigs. Behind every golden curtain at Versailles was a shadow of filth, and they learned to worship the gold and ignore the shadow. Because to do otherwise was to risk being banished back to Paris, out of the Sun King's light. Versailles had become a church of illusion, and everyone at court would rather rot in its pews than admit the altar was made of waste. No one dared say it, but everyone knew. Versailles did not smell like roses. It smelled like power. The filth of Versailles wasn't just a background detail, it was a full-time job for the hundreds of royal servants who lived beneath the golden floors and behind the draped walls. Handling human waste wasn't an occasional burden. It was the defining feature of their daily lives. But in a palace where image was worshipped above all else, Even the act of scrubbing excrement had to be done invisibly. The Sun King's legacy could not reek, and so the smell of Versailles became a state secret, denied, disguised, and buried under crushed lavender, rose petals, and powdered lies. The numbers alone were staggering. More than 3,000 courtiers, nobles, guards, attendants, cooks, dancers, musicians, clergy, and servants lived at Versailles during Louis XIV's reign. With no centralized plumbing, that meant thousands of chamber pots filled daily, some with urine, others with feces, many with both, waiting to be carried by hand out of bedrooms, dressing rooms, salons, libraries, and even the king's private chapel. This was the job of the scourers, low-ranking male servants responsible for emptying pots, wiping up floor spills, and dousing offensive areas with perfume or lime powder. They worked in silence, often in darkness, carrying waste through narrow servant passages built into the walls. These corridors allowed them to move unseen, sliding behind panels or through hidden doors, removing the evidence of rot while the court waltzed through perfumed hallucination. But the system was hopelessly overwhelmed. There were not enough scourers, not enough time, and not enough places to pour the waste. Dumping buckets into the gardens was common practice. So was flinging them out of windows late at night with a quick shout of "Garde à l'eau," a warning for anyone below. Over time, the palace grounds became sodden, stained, and crawling with flies. Pools of human waste formed behind hedges. Servants tracked filth back into the halls on their shoes. Chamber pots often leaked or cracked. Some nobles, in a rush or out of laziness, simply defecated on stairwells or behind doorways, leaving messes that would remain for hours, sometimes days, before being found and scrubbed. The stench was constant, particularly in summer. When heat thickened the air, the scent of sweat, rotting food, dead rodents, and human waste mixed into a dense fog that settled in the corridors. Candles and incense couldn't compete. Fresh flowers wilted quickly. Perfume was poured on curtains and rugs in gallons. Still, the smell returned, and everyone in power pretended not to notice, because the illusion of Versailles had to be protected at all costs. For foreign dignitaries and visiting monarchs, special efforts were made. Before state visits, rooms were scrubbed furiously. Windows were opened for hours, rare at a court paranoid about drafts. Servants were ordered to flush scented water along stairways, a temporary trick to mask the reek. Yet visitors still noticed. Letters from foreign ambassadors survive today with phrases like "an oppressive sweetness that sits like oil on the nose," or "a scent I dare not describe in words lest it insult His Majesty." Some ambassadors vomited after long days inside the palace. Others requested outdoor meetings or shorter audiences. One wrote simply, "I have seen paradise, but it stinks." Still, no one dared confront Louis directly. The Sun King did not acknowledge odor. If anything, he found the entire matter beneath him. His personal attendants were trained to remove waste during his morning lever as discreetly as possible. His own chamber pot, a gold-plated commode, was cleaned 3 times daily with scented cloths and vinegar. He would often apply ambergris oil beneath his nose before long court sessions, dulling his own senses to what surrounded him. But beyond his apartments, the rot spread. Servants were forbidden from speaking of it. Noblewomen who whispered complaints risked losing access to the Queen's circle. Lower staff were beaten for gossip. Versailles had become a place where truth was punished, especially if it smelled. And so, the filth was covered, not cleaned. Carpets laid over stained floors, drapes hung over piss-soaked walls, decorative vases placed near corners known to attract the worst odors. And always, perfume. Gallons of it. Enough to burn the lungs, enough to make eyes water, enough to make you forget, if only briefly, that you were standing in the most luxurious toilet ever built. But not everyone forgot. The lower servants, the ones who scrubbed, the ones who scooped, the ones who dragged urine-soaked mattresses out of noble bedrooms. They remembered. They wrote letters. They passed jokes. They carved symbols into basement walls to mark the worst-smelling halls. One recorded in a hidden journal that the smell in the Queen's salon was like damp wool and teeth pulled from a horse, but no one read those words, not for centuries, because above them, in the halls of gold, history was being painted, one silk robe at a time. The myth of Versailles was too valuable to be tarnished by the truth. The palace was the beating heart of France. Its gardens had to smell like heaven, not latrines. Its halls had to sparkle. Its king had to glow. So the stench became a ghost, present in every breath, but never spoken aloud. And in that silence, filth became invisible. Rot became tradition. And Versailles, the most magnificent palace in Europe, became the most fragrant lie the world had ever built. The walls of Versailles stank, but the true rot sat on the throne. Beneath the crimson robes, beneath the powdered wig, beneath the godlike titles and gilded portraits, King Louis XIV himself was decaying. The man who called himself the Sun, who ruled France with divine authority, who built a palace to reflect celestial order, was being slowly eaten alive by infection, by disease, by his own body's rebellion. And yet, just like the stench in his halls, it was never spoken of. Not by courtiers, not by doctors, not even by the king himself, because in a kingdom of illusion, a dying god still had to smile. From the outside, he looked immortal. His image was carefully curated. Tall shoes to boost his height, stiff corsets to hold his posture, vast wigs to hide baldness. But up close, Louis's flesh told a different story. His teeth had begun rotting in his 30s. By his 40s, they were blackened, abscessed, and falling out. Surgeons pulled them with metal tools in unsanitary conditions, tearing at the gums until bone was exposed. The result? A hole between his mouth and nasal cavity, causing liquids to leak out of his nose whenever he drank. His breath became unbearable. Sores festered along his jawline. Yet, in court, he still smiled. The worst, however, was not in his mouth. In 1686, the Sun King developed an excruciating condition, an anal fistula, an infected tunnel between the rectum and the skin that caused constant bleeding, discharge, and agony when walking or sitting. For any ordinary man, this would have meant quiet suffering. For Louis, it meant a national crisis. His body wasn't just his own, it was France's symbol of strength. The court was paralyzed. Ministers panicked. The illness was kept secret. While the king winced in pain, while pus soaked through his undergarments, rumors of weakness had to be crushed. The result was one of the most infamous medical events in European history, the royal anal fistula surgery. There was no anesthesia, there were no antibiotics. And yet, on November 18th, 1686, Louis XIV was strapped to a table while royal surgeon Charles-François Félix used a specially designed curved scalpel, crafted over months of testing on prisoners and the poor, to slice into the king's infected flesh, drain the abscess, and cut out the tunnel of infection. He screamed. His attendants wept. And yet, the king survived. The court erupted in celebration. Churches rang bells. Medals were minted. Paintings were commissioned of the surgeon holding the golden scalpel. The Sun King, they declared, had conquered death. But the truth was far more tragic. The infection returned multiple times. The wound never fully healed. Louis continued to suffer quietly, his robes often lined with cloth to absorb bleeding, his steps calculated to avoid pain. His attendants learned to read his eyes, watching for signs that he could no longer bear standing. His chairs were padded with layers of cloth. He ate little, spoke less, but always maintained the image. His doctors prescribed wine-soaked rags, herbal poultices, and powdered gold to be rubbed on the wound, a desperate ritual with no effect. And while the court praised his recovery, his body continued to betray him. He developed chronic leg ulcers, his hair thinned, his vision blurred, his hearing faltered. Skin infections spread beneath the layers of powder and perfume, but none of it could be allowed to reach the surface. Louis banned any portraits that showed him seated. He stood as often as he could, clutching his cane. His wigs grew taller to offset his slouched frame. More makeup, more gold, more ceremonies. As his organs failed, his schedule intensified. He greeted courtiers in the morning, attended mass in the afternoon, inspected fountains in the evening. Pain was disguised as poise. Rot was disguised as ritual, and everyone around him obeyed the illusion. His surgeons drained wounds daily. His barbers applied perfumes until his skin blistered. His clothes were lined with herbs. Every inch of his body was managed, handled, masked, except the disease inside him which no one could stop. Yet no one dared speak of it. The king's weakness was never acknowledged. His blood-stained undergarments were burned in secret. His absences explained as private reflection. Even his altered speech, from a mouth too ruined to pronounce certain words, was interpreted as elegance, not decay. His courtiers bowed to a god, but under the velvet, that god was dying slowly, painfully, constantly. In the last decade of his life, Louis's body swelled with edema. His kidneys began to fail. He developed gangrene in his leg, which blackened and oozed, emitting a stench that no amount of incense could erase. Still, he ruled. Still, he stood. And when he collapsed, finally, in 1715, after 72 years of rule, his body was so decomposed that embalmers struggled to prepare it. The smell reached the halls. The rot could no longer be hidden, and yet the funeral was immaculate. White robes, gold casket, incense burned in clouds. The Sun King had set, but his myth had already risen, untouched by blood, by pus, by reality. And that was Versailles, a place where even a rotting god had to shine. If the marble walls of Versailles could speak, they wouldn't whisper poetry, they would itch, because long before tourists walked its polished floors, long before historians romanticized its chandeliers and its mirrors and its music, Versailles was crawling, literally, beneath the gowns, inside the mattresses, behind the drapes, and under the floorboards. The parasites of France fed freely on royalty. Lice in powdered wigs, fleas in perfumed slippers, rats scuttling beneath gold-trimmed beds, and nobody spoke of it. Not because they didn't know, but because they couldn't afford to care. In Louis XIV's court, to acknowledge discomfort was to admit weakness, and to complain about lice while holding a goblet of imported wine in a ballroom of hand-painted ceilings was to suggest that the Sun King's empire was anything less than perfect. That was dangerous. That was suicidal. So instead, they scratched silently in the grand chambers of the nobles, where beds stretched wider than banquet tables and tapestries hung over every surface. Lice nested in the seams of mattresses, in the folds of curtains, in the seams of collars. Court fashion demanded layers upon layers of fabric, corsets, chemises, petticoats, cloaks, lace, stockings. Underneath all of that, skin sweated, hair remained unwashed. Bodies went weeks without bathing, and the lice thrived. Wigs were shared, hats were passed from one noble to another, combs were rarely washed. One noblewoman was recorded as combing over 100 lice out of her wig before a ball. The remedy? Powder it more, add perfume, and carry on. Fleas were another constant. The dogs that roamed the palace freely, many of them pets of courtiers or even the king himself, carried them into every chamber. These animals were rarely washed, often fed scraps of rotting food, and allowed to sit on laps, lie on beds, and sleep on rugs. At night, nobles would lie on feather mattresses that had never been cleaned, their legs covered in bites by morning. Yet no one dared say, "I'm uncomfortable," because comfort was not the currency of Versailles. Access was. You were there to be seen, to be included, to touch the hem of power. If that meant sleeping in a lice-ridden room with no toilet and a rat beneath your bed, you smiled through it. Speaking up meant exile. Staying silent meant advancement. Even the queen was not spared. In letters written in cipher between maids, descriptions survive of a nest behind the headboard, a bite upon the thigh that would not stop bleeding, and the tail of a rodent seen disappearing under the sheet. But these letters were hidden, because once read aloud, they became threats to the crown. Versailles could not stink. Versailles could not scratch. The most grotesque evidence of infestation was, of course, the rats. They ran freely through the basements, where food was stored with no refrigeration, where blood from the kitchens seeped into the stone, where crumbs from royal feasts were swept beneath rugs instead of removed. These rats were not timid. They chewed through boots. They gnawed at the corners of tapestries. Some entered the servants' quarters at night and bit sleeping staff. One account even described a rat found drowned in a wine jug the morning after a ball, its body bloated, its fur still floating beneath the surface as the guests toasted to the glory of France. Poison was used. Traps were set. Cats were brought in. But the rats remained. Because the structure of Versailles itself, its pipes, its hollow walls, its unsealed kitchens, invited them, and because the appearance of elegance mattered more than the machinery of cleanliness, to exterminate meant acknowledging infestation, and that could not be allowed. So the nobles tiptoed around the evidence. They powdered their wigs thicker. They sprayed their feet with lavender water before pulling on flea-infested shoes. They lit candles beside their beds, not just for romance, but to watch for shadows. The silence was part of the performance, and in that performance, parasites were absorbed into power. Lice became another itch to hide. Fleas became background texture. Rats became jokes. The king's smallest advisors, one servant wrote sarcastically in a private letter never meant to be seen. But what made this most disturbing was not the filth itself. It was the court's pride in enduring it. To suffer quietly was noble. To scratch without grimacing was strength. One noble woman was praised for continuing her dance despite a visible infestation upon the nape of her neck. Another was admired for never once lifting her skirts while rats crawled through the ballroom. The rot became the ritual, and Versailles, for all its grandeur, became the most elegant parasite host in human history, a place where gold leaf covered, mold, perfume masked blood, and courtiers kissed the ring while their scalps bled in silence. To the world, it was perfection, but to those who slept in the rooms and bled into the pillows, it was a lie they had to wear like a crown. The filth of Versailles could not be washed, so it was masked, not removed, not cleaned, not scrubbed from the marble or burned from the linens. It was drowned, daily, desperately, decadently, in perfume. More than a fragrance, scent became a strategy, a state tool, a political armor against truth. In a world where rats ran through drawing rooms and nobles defecated behind velvet curtains, perfume was the crown's final defense, its camouflage, its denial, and its weapon. There was no such thing as smelling nice at Versailles. You either smelled royal or you smelled like the poor, and the difference was not hygiene. It was chemistry. Bottles of ambergris, civet musk, rose oil, violet tinctures, crushed herbs, dried flowers, and vinegar distillations were poured into every crack of the palace. Walls were misted with lavender. Drapes were soaked in orange blossom water. Even the candles were made of scented wax, releasing waves of sweetness as they melted through hours of rot. This wasn't luxury, it was warfare. The goal wasn't to smell beautiful. The goal was to smell more than everything else, to outmuscle the stench of urine in the halls, the vomit in the kitchens, the feces beneath stairwells, the bloodied linens stuffed under the queen's bed. The court became addicted. Noble women carried pomanders, ornate orbs filled with perfume-soaked sponges, dangling from silk belts or chains, always ready to be lifted to the nose when the air grew too thick. Men wore scented gloves, reeking of cinnamon, cloves, or bergamot, not just for show, but to press to their faces while walking past corridors that had not been cleaned in weeks. Some even smeared perfumes inside their nostrils to numb their senses. Court doctors prescribed perfumes as treatments to combat disease, to purify the blood, to ease nerves. The belief in miasma, that disease spread through foul air, made scent a form of survival, but the result was suffocating. The perfume didn't cleanse the air, it layered it, thickened it, turned the atmosphere into a sticky fog of decomposition sweetened by crushed petals and animal musk. And the ingredients were not delicate. Ambergris, for instance, came from whale vomit. Civet musk was extracted from the glands of a wild cat's anus. These were the base notes of Versailles, raw, earthy, fermented, blended with rose or violet to create an illusion of refinement. They were applied to skin that hadn't been washed in days, on top of sweat, sores, and powder. Perfume became rot's closest cousin, inseparable, always arriving second, always too late. When Louis XIV walked into a chamber, his scent preceded him. It was said you could smell the king before you saw him. Cloves, amber, and musk, mixed with the faint sourness of a body that hadn't touched water in weeks. His attendants sprayed his wigs, his clothes, his shoes. His chamber pots were rinsed with rosewater. His linens were pressed with sachets of crushed iris. But still, the infections festered. Still, the ulcers bled. And still, the scent of Versailles clung to every inch of stone like a lie too expensive to tell. Perfume wasn't just used to cover the court, it was used to judge it. A weak scent meant a weak noble. A fading smell meant fading influence. People were ranked by their fragrance, complimented for it, envied for it, accused over it. Some nobles were rumored to steal the queen's perfume formula just to gain favor. Others were ridiculed for sweating too quickly through their scent. It was a hierarchy of odor. To reek of sweat was shame. To reek of gardenia and civet was survival. But perfume had limits. It did not kill lice. It did not kill rats. It did not purify blood or cleanse ulcers or fix the gangrenous legs of aging dukes. All it did was deceive, and in Versailles, that was enough. When a guest complained, they were offered scented handkerchiefs. When a servant fainted from fumes, they were dismissed. When food rotted, spices were dumped onto it until the smell faded. When a noble died, their corpse was embalmed in scent, displayed for days as if they had simply fallen asleep beneath a cloud of roses. No one washed the walls, they washed the air. But the palace remembered. The stone soaked up the stench, the tapestries held it in their threads. The perfume reacted with the filth and created a new odor entirely. Sweet rot. That's what visitors remembered most. Not the flowers, not the feasts, not even the gold, but the feeling of standing in a room where everything was beautiful and everything was dying. And in that scent, they found Versailles. Not a palace, a stage, not a home, a mask. A world where the most powerful people on earth lived in filth so potent they had to drown it in perfume and call it elegance. They stood like statues, adorned in brocade and pearl, with lashes powdered, cheeks painted, waists cinched so tight they could barely breathe. They moved like porcelain, graceful, restrained, rehearsed, and behind them, every eye in Versailles watched, measured, judged. But what no one ever said aloud, and what the history books often forget, is that beneath those layers of silk and lace, the women of court were quietly bleeding. Because in the palace of spectacle, their pain was the price of presence, and at Versailles, beauty was survival. A woman's worth in Louis XIV's court wasn't just in her lineage or wit, it was in how perfectly she could endure the agony of expectation without flinching. Corsets were not fashion, they were weapons, rib-crushing structures of bone, steel, and linen, often pulled so tight that internal organs shifted. Women passed out at dinners, fainted during balls, collapsed in garden mazes, not from emotion, from compression, but collapsing wasn't shameful, it was elegant. A fainting woman was delicate, controlled, fragile in a way that signaled class. One courtier wrote that women often carried smelling salts sewn into rings, not for drama, but because they knew they would likely lose consciousness before dessert, and they had to recover quickly, with a smile. The gowns themselves were heavy. Some weighed 30 to 40 pounds. The more fabric, the more prestige. But that meant standing for hours in shoes without soles, feet bound by ribbons that cut through skin. And still, they stood. Bladders were ignored. Painful menstruation was unspoken. Even pregnancy was no excuse. One duchess danced through an entire evening, her dress hiding the fact that she had just suffered a miscarriage, because to leave early was to be forgotten, and to be forgotten was death in the social order of Versailles. The women's hair was another battlefield. Towering structures of wire and padding rose nearly a foot above their skulls, decorated with miniature ships, birds, candles, or entire tableaus of war victories. These wigs were not removed for weeks. Lice nested in them. Scalp sores developed beneath the powder. When the hair finally came off, it often brought chunks of skin with it. But the illusion was always maintained. To bleed beneath your wig was a private thing. To let it show was disgrace. Many women walked with blood-stained linens pressed between their legs, hidden by hoop skirts, while smiling through operas, kissing the king's hand, or laughing at court gossip. Maids reported changing undergarments soaked with both blood and perfume, then reapplying powder before anyone could notice. Even in death, the pain didn't end. Some women were embalmed while still bleeding internally, the pressure of corsets having caused ruptured uteruses, organ shifts, collapsed lungs. But the autopsies were hushed. Their portraits remained flawless. Their letters, if found, were edited, because Versailles was a place where a woman's beauty was both her armor and her prison, and the moment she let the illusion slip, she was replaced. The queen herself, Marie-Thérèse, was known to bleed heavily during illness, her body bloated and weary, yet she still appeared in court every Sunday, powdered and perfumed, to stand beside the king as the symbol of France's virtue. Her miscarriages were hidden behind layers of satin. Her depression, likely postpartum, was dismissed as moodiness. She died young, and no one changed a thing. The court applauded her composure, not her suffering, and that was the rule. The women at Versailles weren't fragile. They were gladiators, but their arena was made of candlelight, gossip, and bone corsets. Their weapons were smiles, perfume, and silence, and their reward? A seat near the king, even if it meant standing for hours, bleeding, itching, and gasping beneath 3 layers of steel-laced fabric, because at Versailles, to be beautiful was to be broken, quietly, elegantly, in full view of everyone, and noticed by no one. The tables sparkled with gold, Polished silver platters gleamed beneath candlelight. Dishes arrived one after another: pheasant glazed in honey, rabbit stuffed with almond paste, eels wrapped in pastry, oysters chilled in ice from imported glaciers. From a distance, it looked divine. But in the belly of Versailles, where cooks toiled in unventilated stone chambers and pantries rotted in silence, the food that fed kings was often the same food that silently killed them. Because in a palace obsessed with appearance, taste didn't matter, and safety mattered even less. There were no refrigerators, no hygiene standards, no knowledge of bacteria, and the kitchen, hidden behind marble halls and manicured gardens, was a world of decay. Meat sat out for days. Fish arrived from the coast, half-spoiled, reeking of salt and death. Milk soured before it reached the stove. Chefs simply drowned it all in spices, sugar, and fat. That was the Versailles solution. Make it look perfect, smell powerful, and serve it before the rot made them vomit. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it didn't. The cooks, often dozens of them working shoulder to shoulder, slathered rotting pork with cinnamon, masked green-gray goose flesh with red wine, boiled cream that had begun to curdle, and stuffed maggot-ridden pheasants with orange zest. To question it was treason, because food wasn't just food in Versailles, it was theater. Every dish was a performance for the king, a chance for nobles to show off their wealth, their power, their connection to exotic ingredients. To send back a dish was to insult a chef, and insult a chef was to insult the system. And so, guests smiled, nodded, and swallowed the poison with pride. Bread was often baked with rancid flour. Cheese arrived covered in fly eggs. Fruit came waxed and painted to appear fresher than it was. There were stories of nobles biting into fruits stuffed with crushed glass, placed there by jealous rivals, or sugar sculptures hiding insects placed on the queen's table for a laugh. But even when it wasn't sabotage, the food was a gamble. Several courtiers died from stomach infections. Others lost teeth from biting into spoiled pastries or hardened bone hidden inside poorly butchered birds. And still, the next day, the feasting continued. The plates were cleaned, not with soap, but with vinegar and cloth. The knives were passed from hand to hand. The servers rarely washed between courses. Servants with festering boils carried meat to the table, dripping sweat onto napkins, sneezing near the sauces. One royal physician reportedly tracked an entire outbreak of dysentery to a single spoon used by multiple guests at a garden feast. But none of it stopped. Because food, like everything else at Versailles, was about illusion. The deeper the rot, the heavier the garnish. The older the meat, the more elaborate the glaze. And the nobles ate it up, literally. They praised the spice without knowing it was hiding decay. They toasted to the king while vomiting behind curtains between courses. And if someone collapsed at the table, it wasn't blamed on food. It was their weak blood, their bad nerves, their destiny. The servants knew the truth. Some refused to eat anything that came from the royal kitchens. Others begged for peasant stew over palace pastry. In secret, they traded simple bread and cheese with outside workers, unperfumed, unspiced, but clean. They watched nobles writhe in their beds from foodborne illness, and still, the next day, dressed them for another feast. Because Versailles did not believe in correction. It believed in repetition. And so the food, decorated, dangerous, divine in appearance, but demonic in effect, remained the same. The chefs were praised. The rot was silenced. And the most powerful people in France kept dying at dinner without ever knowing why. For all its chandeliers and golden mirrors, Versailles had no plumbing, no toilets, no sewer system, just marble, just velvet, just centuries of human waste hidden behind perfume and protocol. And while the court spoke of elegance and virtue, the floors beneath their silken slippers were soaked in secrets that stank. Because in truth, Versailles, the palace of the Sun King, was rotting from the inside out. Let's be clear. There were over 700 rooms at Versailles, and barely a handful had designated privies, and even those were barely more than glorified buckets. So where did the nobles relieve themselves? Anywhere, everywhere, behind stairwells and fireplaces, beneath tapestries. Even during outdoor events, nobles were known to relieve themselves in garden corners, beside statues or under banquet tables. Chamber pots overflowed in corners of ballrooms and were left unattended for hours. Servants carried them through halls like trays of tea, sloshing, reeking, uncovered, and sometimes dropped them. No one blinked. Human waste seeped into floorboards. It dried beneath rugs. It pooled behind curtains. And no, this wasn't peasantry. This was royalty. Dukes, duchesses, the king's own guests, even the queen. One guest wrote, in a letter never meant to be public, that he watched a marquise urinate behind a tapestry mid-conversation without stopping her sentence. Why? Because the trek to the servant's privy was too far, too public, too beneath her. So she did what Versailles did best, hid the filth and smiled. There were secret chairs, elaborately carved thrones that doubled as toilets, positioned behind screens or inside closets. But these were few. Most people used chamber pots and left them behind. Often there were no servants to collect them in time. The heat from candles and fireplaces made the smell unbearable, so perfume was sprayed. Lavender sachets were crushed beneath chairs. Rose water was splashed across the floors. It helped for 5 minutes. Then the stench returned. And servants? They bore the burden. Maids were tasked with scraping dried feces off marble. Footmen carried soiled linens down halls without gloves. Some wrote, in hidden journals, of vomit-stained carpets that hadn't been cleaned in months. Others detailed rats attracted by the urine puddles in guest quarters. One valet claimed he had to sleep in a room so thick with ammonia I could not breathe. But speaking up meant exile. So they worked in silence. The royal stables were worse. Horses defecated freely. Manure was dumped just outside the palace walls, where it ran down into the river and back into the palace through poorly placed drains. When rain came, waste flowed through the halls. Shoes were ruined, dresses stained. Yet the dances continued. Versailles even had a nickname among lower servants, the Golden Sewer, because no matter how bright the rooms were, the smell never quite left. The court physicians blamed bad air for disease outbreaks, but the cause was obvious: feces in the walls, waste beneath the floorboards, food prepared beside human excrement. Even the famed Hall of Mirrors had been host to chamber pots during crowded events. There are records of diplomats slipping on urine in side corridors, of children vomiting from the stench in guest quarters, of fleas born in feces biting into noble flesh during royal banquets. But no reform came, because reform meant admission, and Versailles was a lie too sacred to correct. When foreign visitors arrived, servants scrubbed visible stains, sprayed citrus oils across rugs, and burned incense at doorways. But even they commented in letters, "The palace glitters, but it reeks." It wasn't just a hygiene problem, it was a design flaw. The palace was never meant to house thousands of courtiers. It was a hunting lodge turned into a kingdom. And instead of fixing the structure, they buried the problem beneath perfume, powder, and silence. That silence cost lives, disease outbreaks, Typhus, dysentery, boils, fevers became common. And still no toilets, no running water, just gold and feces, intertwined, hidden, forgotten only because it was inconvenient to remember. The disease didn't knock. It walked through the palace doors wearing silk. It bowed before the king, kissed the queen's hand, and danced in the salons with powdered wigs and rouge-stained cheeks. Because at Versailles, sickness wasn't seen as weakness. It was seen as inevitable, something to be decorated, powdered, and perfumed, something to be ignored. But underneath the brocade and jewels, the noble class of France was rotting from within. And no disease symbolized this silent decay more than syphilis, the royal infection. It didn't just afflict the poor or the desperate. It ravaged the upper class, passed quietly between chambermaids, mistresses, noblemen, and heirs. It disfigured faces, hollowed bones, and turned once beautiful courtiers into trembling shells of their former selves. But the court didn't stop embracing, kissing, or bedding one another. They simply learned to hide the symptoms better. Nobles wore heavy white lead makeup to cover syphilitic sores on their faces. Lips, chewed raw by ulcers or decayed by mercury treatments, were repainted with bright carmine. Wigs grew larger as baldness from the disease became more common. And when the noses began to collapse, a horrifying late-stage symptom, they were replaced with delicate silk patches or tiny wax prosthetics, disguised beneath the masks or veils. Some courtiers became so disfigured they could only appear at night or behind screens. But no one spoke of it, because if the palace was infected, then the myth of Versailles was infected too, and that couldn't be allowed. Gums bled almost universally. The sugar-rich diets, lack of dental hygiene, and abscess-causing infections made dental decay a court epidemic. Teeth fell out during dinners. Breath stank so fiercely that guests would subtly place scented handkerchiefs over their noses mid-conversation. But again, not a word was said. They just smiled through the pain. Some nobles carried silver toothpicks in public, not as utensils, but as emergency tools, to remove maggot eggs, drain, gum, abscesses, or pry loose pieces of meat that stuck to infected mouths. The royal physicians tried remedies: mercury rubs, powdered toadstones, bleeding sessions, or clove oil rubbed onto ulcerated gums. But none of it worked. It only delayed the collapse. And still, the dinners went on. Still, the dances continued. Because Versailles was not a palace of healing. It was a theater of denial. Every noblewoman who bled through her corset from an untreated infection, every man who trembled at the wrist from mercury poisoning, every child born with lesions or weakness from inherited disease, they were all dressed up, powdered, paraded, and presented as the image of divine France. In private, people begged for cures. In public, they complimented each other's powdered cheeks and smiled through blackening teeth. The king himself suffered abscesses and ulcers. His personal physicians reported rotting gums, chronic pain, and a distended stomach from internal infections. But he continued the rituals. He appeared in public. He kissed nobles. He passed the same cup during communion. Because stopping, resting, admitting illness would have been admitting that the most perfect palace on earth was sick at its core. So Versailles wore its disease like it wore its perfume. Layered, intentional, and unavoidable. The servants saw it. They watched nobles limp from one room to another, coughing blood into silk napkins. They heard the whispers of miscarriages, secret amputations, failed births, and royal children dying young with strange symptoms. But their job was not to comment. Their job was to wipe the blood, reset the wig, and keep the mask in place. Behind every glowing portrait of Versailles was a reality of infection, pain, and slow bodily ruin. And yet, not a single painting ever showed it, because in the world of Versailles, Even death had to look beautiful. The king did not sleep in private, he performed it, because in Versailles, even the act of going to bed, and sometimes what happened in it, was a stage. The royal rising and retiring ceremonies, known as the lever and coucher, were elaborate public rituals attended by nobles, ministers, and foreign dignitaries. What the world believed was the king's most intimate space, his bedroom, was in fact a court chamber with an audience. Behind the silk curtains, the king was expected to father heirs, but beyond duty, sex in Versailles was never just personal, it was political, and just like everything else in the palace, it often occurred in rooms that stank of mildew, on unwashed sheets, under canopies teeming with moths. The royal bed, the literal seat of dynastic survival, was cleaned less than once a month. Servants dusted the silk hangings but rarely washed the mattress itself. Stains were perfumed, not removed. The linen beneath the king and queen became so discolored from sweat, oils, and blood that pages were often instructed to flip the sheets instead of replacing them. Midwives and chambermaids, who witnessed births, wrote of fleas crawling over the newborn skin before it was even swaddled. Yet none of this was considered scandalous, because in Versailles, cleanliness did not define nobility. Ceremony did. When Louis XIV chose to conceive an heir, courtiers were often invited to witness the beginning, not the act itself, but the moments leading up to it. The queen would be helped into bed in full view. The king would arrive in his nightshirt. Nobles would bow, wish the couple luck, and then politely exit the room, pretending they hadn't just blessed an act of reproduction. These rituals were about control. Everyone at court had to know when the heir was conceived and that it was legitimate. And yet, the surroundings were often anything but royal. Rats skittered across the floor at night. Chamber pots sat unemptied near the headboard. The damp air of the unventilated palace made mildew cling to every fabric surface. One servant recorded that during an heir's birth, the room smelled so foul that candles had to be lit just to mask it, and while the child was presented to court as clean and holy, those present knew the sheets beneath bore the marks of more than just labor. They bore the rot of Versailles itself. Mistresses too shared these beds, often in quick succession. The king's favorites were gifted chambers near his own, but even they complained of lice, bad drainage, and choking dust. The intimacy they offered wasn't rewarded with cleanliness, it was paid for with status. A night with the king meant potential titles, gifts, or influence, but it also meant sleeping in a bed that hadn't been washed since the last mistress. And still, they came, because in Versailles, the bedroom was a battlefield. To be chosen meant power, to conceive meant permanence, and to survive it, both physically and politically, meant winning a war no one admitted was being fought. Even when infections spread from mistress to queen, or when newborns died within days of birth, the system didn't change. Sheets were turned, curtains were pulled, incense was lit, and the rituals went on. Because Versailles wasn't built to nurture, it was built to display, and the most private moments, love, conception, death, became public acts, performed on stages lined with gold, beneath ceilings painted with gods, while the floor beneath the bed soaked slowly with everything the audience chose not to see. There is a moment, just before a storm hits, when the wind pauses and everything feels unnaturally still. That was Versailles in the final years, glistening, glorious, completely still. But underneath the stillness was rot so thick it couldn't be scrubbed away, only sprayed with perfume. Versailles wasn't just a palace, it was a story, one crafted with marble and mirrors, rewritten every morning with powdered wigs and embroidered lies. The people didn't love the monarchy because it was clean or kind or wise. They loved it because it pretended harder than anyone else. The illusion was total. Letters were burned, diaries censored, artists were paid to paint unblemished skin, perfect posture, eternal spring. Courtiers rehearsed how to walk, how to bow, how to faint gracefully if overcome with fever. Servants were ordered to never speak of what they saw. The lice, the stench, the blood stains, the hollowed cheeks of nobles rotting from syphilis. Even disease had a script. Even death had a dress code. Versailles had turned ritual into weaponry. It took human decay and dressed it in silk. It made waste look like wealth, and the world believed it. Visitors left convinced they'd seen heaven on earth, not knowing the velvet curtains they admired had been urinated on the night before. But the truth was bleeding through the seams. By the 1780s, whispers had become rumors, and rumors had become fury. Pamphlets spread through Paris, mocking the Queen's bathing habits, exaggerating court filth, accusing nobles of eating while the poor starved. Some of it was propaganda, but most of it was true, because the peasants had begun to realize what Versailles truly was, not a palace, but a prison of denial. While children in Paris begged for bread, nobles argued over the choreography of who got to pass the king his gloves. While farmers lost teeth from hunger, courtiers used diamond-encrusted toothpicks to clean their rotting gums after banquets. And as the city starved, the palace glowed brighter. That glow became its death sentence. When the revolution came, it wasn't just about money. It was about filth disguised as majesty. It was about the chamber pots behind the marble, the lice beneath the wigs, the sickness behind the smile. The people didn't just want to kill a king. They wanted to shatter a lie. They stormed the gates not just for freedom, but for truth. Versailles tried to hold the illusion until the last second. The guards bowed, the musicians played, the perfumes flowed, but the people smelled blood beneath the roses. And when they came not just with weapons, but with eyes wide open. They tore open the walls, saw the rats, the mold, the waste, the diaries that told the real story. The myth collapsed, not because it was weak, but because it was built on denial. Versailles, once the crown of civilization, became a cautionary tale. A monument to what happens when power hides its filth in gold. And the most terrifying truth? It worked for over a century, because when lies are beautiful enough, even the worst rot can smell like roses. Versailles is still standing. You can visit it, walk its glittering halls, take selfies beneath chandeliers once dimmed by candle smoke. You can run your hand across banisters that once steadied men dying of syphilis. And you can gaze into the mirrors of the Hall of Mirrors, the same glass that once reflected powdered nobles hiding lesions, rotten teeth, and chamber pots behind lace. But the real Versailles isn't what's restored. It's what was hidden. It's the illusion. That filth could be silenced. That disease could be dressed in silk. That power could rewrite truth just by being beautiful. That lesson isn't ancient. It's now. Because Versailles is not just a palace. It's a warning. It's what happens when image becomes more important than substance. When those in power believe that as long as they smile, powder, and spray perfume, no one will notice the rot. But the rot never goes away. It waits. Beneath the curtains, behind the rituals, underneath the weight of 1,000 lies told with style. The people of France believed in the monarchy for decades because it shimmered, because it performed, because it made poverty look like failure and privilege look like divinity, until they saw behind the curtain, until they smelled what was real, until they understood that beauty can be a weapon and silence a prison. And now you reading this are part of that echo, because today we still worship illusion. We still follow power that's been perfumed. We still overlook the filth beneath gold when the performance dazzles us. But Versailles whispers, look closer. Ask harder questions. Don't be fooled by mirrors and marble, because if you wait too long, the curtain falls anyway. And when it does, what's revealed is never just history. It's a reflection of us, of now, of every lie we choose to accept, because it's easier than breathing in the truth. Versailles didn't fall because it was weak. It fell because it convinced itself it was too beautiful to collapse. But the people knew better. And now, so do you.